Welcome everyone to the Canada Energy Policy Simulator webinar. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. We're excited to be launching this very powerful and interesting tool that we hope you'll find to be very informative and starts conversations and discussions and debates on how Canada can move towards a cleaner and prosperous economy. In this webinar, we'll go through an overview of the Energy Policy Simulator. We'll get to see how the tool is used itself and share some insights. There is, you have the function of Q&A to put questions live. We'll try to monitor those and answer the ones that we can during the webinar. We'll have time at the end to answer any questions, to have a bit of an interactive session. So a little bit of an introduction. For those of you who may not be familiar with Pembina Institute, we are a Canadian national not-for-profit and clean energy think tank that has offices across Canada. We conduct technical and policy research in all areas of energy and climate, including buildings, transportation, electricity, renewables, oil and gas, remote communities, and increasingly on equity issues. The Pembina Institute acknowledges the space our organization is headquartered in. I'm based out of Calgary, Alberta. That's the traditional and ancestral territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the bands of the Siksika, Kainai, Kainai, the Nakota Nations, including the bands of Goodstoney, Chiniki, and Burspraw, and the Tsuut'ina Dene Nations. These lands are also home to the Métis Nations of Alberta, Region 3, whose peoples have deep relations to the land. These acknowledgements are some of the beginning steps in our journey of several generations. We share them in the spirit of truth, justice, reconciliation, and to contribute to a more equitable and inclusive future for all. Introducing myself, my name is Ia Balaini. I've been the lead of the Energy Policy Simulator team here at Pembina. I'm an engineer by training. Joining me today is Olivia Ashmore from the Energy Innovation. Energy Innovation is the organization that developed and continues to evolve the Energy Policy Simulator platform. And last but not least, Jason Lamb, our analyst who's been instrumental, among many others, in building this Canada tool. So to begin this, we'd like to maybe just get started with some questions to get a sense of what people are looking for and where they focus on. So this first poll, if you get to see it, basically is just to help us get a sense of which area people are focused on, and we'll soon see some results. Give it a little bit more time for the results to show. Pretty good diversity so far. Thank you for your responses, and we can maybe see the results. So it's pretty clear there's a very good mix, about 45% electricity, 28% industry, 35% oil and gas, just 7% finance. So that's very helpful to know. Thank you for taking the time to answer those. We do have another question in terms of the level of engagement that we have today. And by level of engagement, I mean if it's your full-time job, policy is your full-time job, you can say high or higher than normal. Where if it's adjacent or not necessarily part of your job every day, you can say little, very little, which is fine. Not everybody needs to live and breathe in the policy space. We just wanted to have a feel for who do we have joining us today. So far, vast majority is high to very high, which is great. Yeah, thank you for that. I'll now just turn it to Olivia to give an overview of the Energy Policy Simulator as a platform. So Olivia, off to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Olivia Ashmore. I work for Energy Innovation, and we've partnered with Pembina as well as many other organizations to develop energy policy simulators or EPS models. We cover many regions, over 50% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And this webinar will focus on the Canadian EPS. Although we do also have an Alberta model that at this point is on an older model platform and a little bit outdated data sources, but it is available for your use as well. Next slide. Our energy policy simulator is a fully open source and peer-reviewed model. Users can download the model using a software called Vensim, can run it for free on their home computer. The model has also been extensively peer-reviewed and documented. It's been reviewed by national labs in the US, university researchers, and by our global partners. There are directions at energypolicy.solutions that explain how to download and use the model for your own use. And there's also a detailed methodological documentation that breaks down how the model calculates different outputs by sector. There's also a link to download the Canadian EPS in full, which includes all the underlying data, some descriptions of methodology, and the model itself in Vensim. Next slide. So the EPS is a hybrid model. It takes primarily existing model data from reputable, typically federally produced sources. And then we use this underlying data to create our own forecast that combines both bottom-up and top-down modeling results. So top-down results typically start with the big picture, things like GDP and population forecast, and use that to look at trends in energy consumption or economic growth. But we also take bottom-up data, which is observed data on things like energy consumption or historical electricity production, and use that within our model as well. Next slide. So the EPS is built using a system dynamics framework, which is a modeling methodology that allows us to track, for example, stocks and flows like vehicle stock, and allows us to study complex interactions within policies. So in this example, we can look at the combined impacts of two different policies and see their incremental emissions reductions. So in the first example, we might have an EV policy and a clean electricity policy that each individually would, reduce total emissions by 1 metric ton. But when they combine together, they're going to produce even greater emissions than either of those policies would on their own. However, we also have the opposite accounted for. So an energy efficiency policy that reduces total electricity demand is going to make the effectiveness of a clean electricity policy a little less than it would have been otherwise. So even if both are, contributing 1 metric ton reduction on their own, combined, these are going to be less than 2 metric tons. Next slide. The EPS model is economy-wide. It covers industry, buildings, and transportation, and all of those feed into the electricity and hydrogen demand sectors. We also have a CCS module to account for CCS. We have a fuels module, which tracks fuel consumption and costs, a research and development module, which tracks improvements in technology like batteries and electric vehicles. We have a land use module, which tracks total land use emission sinks. And all of those come together to produce outputs in terms of pollutants and cash flows. We track greenhouse gas emissions as well as criteria air pollutants. This allows us to produce changes in health outcomes like changes in premature mortality or asthma-related impacts. And then the cash flow changes are fed into an input-output model, which is embedded in the EPS and tracks changes in economy-wide spending. This allows us to see differences in jobs and GDP under different policy scenarios. Our entire model runs in an annual time step, so you can produce outputs for every year between 2019 and 2050. I'm now going to hand it over to Jason, who's going to provide a demonstration of the tool and talk more about its uses.
All right, thank you, Olivia. I'm going to be leading us through the demo of the EPS website. Just wanted to set the stage a little bit. Just wanted to remind people that it is a difference model. So we have our baseline, which has business as usual data and includes legislative policies up to 2021. And the user is able to implement policy levers and implement custom timelines. And that creates a policy scenario that is different from the baseline data. All right. This is the EPS landing page. You can see here where the EPS is available for different countries around the world. We're going to be focusing on Canada here. And here's the Canada landing page. There's a documentation up above in the top right, and this gives you background information on how the EPS is made, the coding behind it, as well as regional information. So here is the Canada section. It has the model for full download here, as well as overarching assumptions for the business as usual, key data sources, as well as sector-specific assumptions. So we're going to enter the model. So we'll click the Enter Simulator button. And this is the main interface for the EPS. Over to the right is the main graphical element of the EPS. There's two lines. There's a business as usual, which is a black line underneath this red line, and the new scenario is what we'll be adjusting. Over to the left here is where you'll be implementing the policy levers. We have main categories here, such as transportation, buildings and appliances, electricity supply, industry, agriculture, etc. And then there are policy levers that we'll be able to adjust in here. In addition, over in the bottom left-hand corner is a little summary of all the policies you've implemented. So I will just show this example scenario for the time being, just to show you what I mean by it's a different scenario. The business as usual is shown in black here, while the policy package that we've got here shows you the difference from that. All right. So I'm going to show you how to implement a policy. So we're going to go into transportation and go into the zero emissions vehicle sales standard. And here you can adjust the policy by moving the slider bar. So I'm going to move it to 50% here, and you can see that it moves a little bit in real time. But to show this a bit better, I'm going to go to a different graph. Also, there are many visuals available for the EPS. There's major categories in emissions, effects by policy, financial, electricity generation, transportation, and different subgraphs that you can choose. So these are often more granular versions of the data. So I'm going to go to transportation. So this is just the transportation emissions. And when I toggle this, you can see it goes down quite a bit in real time. And there's different categories within the policy. So for example, if I wanted to say, the easier to electrify, have the shift in sales for passenger vehicles, you could set those to 100%. You can see it have its effect there, but the rest are not. So you have some flexibility in what and how this policy is implemented. In addition, there's this learn about this policy here. This gives you some background information on how this policy is implemented, how it works, as well as information about the categories that are available within it. And we have some guidance for setting the values. This is usually in terms of proposed legislature that hasn't been adopted yet, but how you could simulate it in a policy scenario. Now, you can also change this implementation schedule for these policies. By default, the EPS model will phase in these policies linearly at 100% by 2050. And when I say linearly by 100% by 2050, it means 100% of the value here. So For cars and SUVs, it's 100% by 2050, but for buses, it's 100%, which means 52% by 2050. So you can also customize these timelines, like I said, by clicking add and say 2030, 100%, click OK. You can see this adjusts here. If you go save, it adjusts in real time. Additionally, you can have a few unique things where, say, a policy is changed in the future. You can add that, go save, and it's reflected there. All right. So I'm going to go to one of our example scenarios. This here is our path to 2030 scenario. This is an example of how Canada could potentially meet its ERP 2030 target, the emissions reduction plan target. You can see a description of it here. And the path to 2050 is an emissions reduction, is a policy package that gets Canada to net zero emissions by 2050. Now I'm going to go over some of the useful graphs that you can look at in the EPS. One is the wedge diagram. The wedge diagram is useful because it allows you to see which policies have the most impacts in reducing emissions. It just takes a little bit for it to calculate, but it will show it soon, hopefully. There we go. All right, so you can see we have a legend here with all the colors and policies, but you can see that electrification hydrogen has reduced emissions by 176 megatons, millions metric tons of CO2 equivalent, as well as building component electrification and zero emission vehicle sales standards. So you can use this to get an idea of which impacts are attributed to which policy levers. Another one is the CO2 material abatement cost curve. This shows you which policy levers are most economically efficient for reducing emissions. So the wider a block is, the more emissions it reduces, while policy levers that are below the x-axis are more economically efficient versus ones that are above the x-axis. Next, we have financials, such as the change in jobs. This is specific to this policy package that we just have as an illustrative example. But you can see here that there's a positive change in jobs up to 2050 with just like a downwards trend in the later years, but still increasing jobs in Canada. You can see it for different things like other jobs, manufacturing, and fossil oil and gas industries. Another one that's useful is the electricity generation. In this policy package, there's a clean electricity push. So by 2035, it's almost all clean electricity generation, while oil and gas is very minimal. You can see most of it's made by hydro dams as well as onshore wind, with an increasing amount of electricity generation in Canada over the years. Lastly, is one that's specific to this policy scenario, showing the the vehicles by sales. So if you implement a EV sales mandate by 2035, there won't be any more internal combustion vehicles sold anymore, but the rest will be met by battery electric vehicles. But if you look at in terms of the fleet composition of vehicles, you can still see that there's some internal combustion vehicles used at up to like 2045, 2046, just because of the natural stock turnover of the vehicles. In addition, there's some options over here. Give me 1 second. This thing is not behaving as I'd like. But you have some options here where using a scenario, you're able to share or save your scenario here. And when you share an example scenario, you can share it through email, Twitter, LinkedIn, just the general link, and that allows you to have easy collaboration with colleagues, whether to give you feedback or to build upon it. Okay. So with the EPS, there are three main buckets that you'll be affecting, one of them being emissions, energy, as well as economy and health impacts. The EPS has over 80 policy levers to use, and if you download the full model to run offline in Vensim, you're able to see over 8,000 output variables in the model. Now I'm going to pass it off to EAP to talk about some insights from the EPS model.
Thank you, Jason, for that demo. Like Jason said, there are so many variables in the EPS now, especially compared to the previous versions. Now there's about 25 different industries within the industrial system, so you can go through a lot of depth. What I'll go through now is I'll cover some of the insights that will help the users not be too overwhelmed with too many options about two different policies. The graph that I'm showing here is for the example scenario of path to 2030 that's pre-built in the model. And what it shows is it shows the change in emissions compared to the reference scenario between years 2022 and 2050. And those are layered on top of each other by policy. The top policies that I picked in this graph account for about 88% of all emissions reduction in this example. And what's interesting to note here is the top three policies, which is electrification, hydrogen, zero emissions vehicle sales standard, as well as building electrification, all require electrification as well as a cleaner grid. As a reminder, this is just an example of one of the policies that are predetermined. As you change the policy design of the scenario that you build, these results, you'll be able to see these results in real time. I'll also emphasize the fact that in order for you to save the different scenarios and compare them, you will have to just have a username and an email. So by signing up into the tool, you get a free account that allows you to create as many scenarios as you want, as well as share them directly with others to collaborate. Next, we wanted to show one insight that we looked at from some of the scenarios is that the overall energy use in Canada drops despite the growth in the economy. This graph shows the total energy use from 2019 to 2050 and is by fuel. And as we see, the total energy use, when you stack all these different fuels, do continue to slightly drop beyond the year 2030. Again, this is specific to this policy design, which heavily relies on electrification. So you can see that natural gas as energy use continues to drop linearly. But the interesting thing is the electricity and hydrogen generation that's added is less than what would have been in the business as usual scenario. And that's mainly because of the efficiencies. It's also worth noting that in this scenario, hydrogen starts to play an increasing role, mainly in industrial industries, such as steel and cement. But again, you can go and change the level of hydrogen that is needed by sub-scenario. So for example, you can go to the tool and start from this scenario or start a new scenario and adjust how much hydrogen is included down to the sub-industry. So for example, if you want to model increased role of hydrogen in steel manufacturing or in refining, you can sub-select that specific industry and change the hydrogen versus electrification mix. So we'll go on next. Jason may have shown this in the demo, but there's a lot more to that. So this example, we just wanted to show that you can see the different vehicle sales as well as fleet composition. So in the left graph, what you see here is the number of passenger vehicles that are being sold in Canada by fuel type. You can see just two colors, which is gasoline or electricity powered vehicles. And in this scenario, we assumed a linear trajectory of the sales to be 100% zero emissions by 2035. And what you notice, you can see in the other graph to the right here, is there are more vehicles that's still being sold. The reason for this is we did not rely heavily in this example on mode shifting, which is people using passenger vehicles less, which is another policy you can use. So we just assume that growth continues. But we also noticed that gasoline-powered passenger vehicles that are sold around the year 2035 will continue to be on the road for about 2045, based on the average vehicle life in Canada. And then you can adjust, as you adjust the policy, you can see how that vehicle fleet turnover changes. Again, you can do this for all different types of transportation vehicles. You do the same for medium and heavy duty vehicles, as well as you can change the policy trajectory to see how that impacts the fleet composition, as well as any other outputs that you want in the tool. One warning I'd like to just make sure that people know about is as you look at the options to change the policy, make sure that you click on when it says guidance for this policy. And I'll use this example of carbon pricing. Because the EPS tool is a national model, it does not do a bottoms-up modeling of all the different ways that carbon pricing is implemented in different provinces. So the way it's modeled is a simplified carbon price approach, where we've made some simplification on how the carbon pricing is applied to different industries. So in the case of buildings and transportation, we assumed that carbon pricing is fully used. So if you add an additional carbon pricing to that, you're assuming that it goes on top of what's currently in schedule. Whereas in other sectors that have free allocations, we assume that it's not used. This is probably the one policy that I would just give warning to is before you go and implement it, just make sure that you read the details of this policy, how this policy was designed, and it's a simplified approach. The power of this approach will be you can then see the interaction of this policy with other ones as you adjust the policy trajectories to see how the combined results of the different policies impact overall numbers in terms of emissions, jobs, as well as government revenues. So for those of you who know about different modeling approaches, the EPS is a type of model that is a systems dynamic model, and it uses this input-output approach, which means that it does not solve for a predetermined output. So you design the scenario based on what policies will do in the system, and then the system runs annually to dynamically through the entire model for each year to see what the net impact of these is going to be. This makes it a very powerful tool, but for some uses, but maybe not others. So as you saw in the demo, when Jason was showing the different policy wedges, what happens is the tool itself, the web tool, sends a code to the model to rerun it in the background, and then you see the results. So it's not pulling from a data set that's predetermined, it's actually running the model. And it's happening very fast. The other component here would be just how it models the different policy interactions. And I think we had some questions on that I'll get to in a minute. It also makes for a very good educational and engagement tool in terms of the direction of different policy scenarios. Being an engineer myself, I like to run some sensitivities or many sensitivities. Sometimes when I run one sensitivity, I like to do some more. So this allows the user to just create as many sensitivities as one wants. Other uses that others may rely on other models. I'll just point one example because it does not model electricity based on hourly demand. It models it annually based on demand from different sectors. That may not be the best model to answer questions specific to the electricity grid. It also just assumes simplifies Canada as one big grid, which is certainly not the case. But directionally, in terms of the electricity demand and how that impacts different sectors, all the other industries, the demand from other industries do dynamically change to ask for more generation, and the model allows for that. And the documentation will allow to explain that a little bit more. I'll get to some questions that I saw shortly here, but before we, while I look at that, I'll just have this quick pool based on what you know so far, just to get a sense of, from what you know so far, if people are not sure, don't know, if they think they can explore this tool or not. It's totally fine if people are not sure because you've just been introduced to it, and but we just wanted to get a sense of how people are thinking of looking at this tool. Great, looks like we have all answers right now. So majority, I'd say 58% are still not sure, which then is a good segue into just leaving some time for questions. So to go and use the tool, basically it's just go to Canada.Energy Policy Simulator solutions. You can go and create an account with your email and then go and explore. If people have any further questions, there's a dedicated email to this tool, so you can email us at policysolutions@pembina.org. Again, this will be available for you as well as some of the links after the webinar. So I'll just pause for now and probably turn it to just go through some questions here. So one question that came is if these jobs are modeled as person years, and that's correct. This modeled as person years. There's another question here on how multiple policies are attributed. Olivia, do you have a good quick answer to that? Because it could be a very complicated and long answer. If you have a quick one, great. If not, we probably just take that offline if it's too complicated for the time.
Yeah, I can give a quick answer. The way we assess the incremental impact of one policy is we turn on all the policies and then turn off one at a time and see what the impact on the total package is. So you can kind of visualize just the wedge graph that includes all the different policies. We arrived at the estimate for each policy's contribution to that wedge graph by just incrementally turning off one at a time and then seeing what the difference was.
Thank you for that. Other questions here, and feel free to just add them in the question and answer as we go through them. So there's a question about NOx emissions from hydrogen combustion. So we do have 12 pollutants in the tool itself, which then you can export the data and see the impact of NOx. With respect to hydrogen, I think it uses emissions factor from GREAT, which I don't know if it includes hydrogen or not. Olivia, do you know if hydrogen is included? like to say that it's yes, but I'm not 100% sure because I don't think there's a policy to combust hydrogen in the tool.
Yeah, we do estimate the NOx emissions from hydrogen combustion. That is included by default.
And it's not just NOx, it would include all 12 pollutants that you can see, and there's a breakdown in the results that you can see the breakdown of different emissions. So, for example, if one person is interested in the health impacts of, let's say, particulate matter in a given scenario, you should be able to just model that and see the breakdown of that for different scenarios compared to others. So I know, for example, in the US model, where there's a lot of coal, as you shift that further, you can see the impact of that through both health impacts as well as some of the other emissions. Let's see here, 4 other questions. So there's a question here on policy levers for micro generation solar. I think there is a policy lever for that. So it is available for, I'm not sure if it's called micro generation, but there is a solar policy that you can ramp up in the tool to see how that answers it.
Yeah, I can just add.
Yeah, go ahead, Olivia.
There are 2 policies. They're under the building sector. One is called the distributed solar carve-out, and one is the distributed solar subsidy. And those tackle rooftop solar.
Yeah, we do have another question here of this model being an open source. So the question was, this model maybe a black box, and if there's a chance that could be open source. Maybe I'd just like to clarify that the model itself is open source. You can go and download the entire model with all the code, all the inputs in the model offline, and you can take it apart as much as you want. There are some researchers that have taken the model and recreated their own versions of it. It's version controlled, so all the codes and all the changes are available, I think, through GitHub that you can people can dig deeper into. But effectively, it's all public information and it's all open source. I'll also add that most of the inputs and outputs are all going to be in CSV files. So I'm not a big, I'm not the best in coding, but I really like CSV files. So hopefully that answers that question. Other questions here. Economic impacts policies included in the model. Yes, the economic impacts are there. So it does show jobs, GDP impacts, as well as government revenues. And there are policies you can assign these government revenues depending on different fiscal policies. Question here. It's a question on policies that have no explicit reduction target. So there's a question around subsidies for like how the model looks at subsidies. So for subsidies, the model does have a cash flow component or a cash flow module for each sector, as well as for government revenues. So let's say the subsidies will basically be modeled through the direct cash flow from government. How those subsidies then impact government revenues is through this input-output model that basically where these subsidies are being spent. So, for example, if those subsidies are being put back in the market, then the model will rerun each year through the input-output component, and then that will generate the jobs and GDP impact through the model itself through all the sectors. Of course, this, depending on how you design the allocation of government revenues or spending, you can then see what the fiscal impact of that is. There's a question around breaking results by province or territory. This version of the model is a national model, so it assumes that Canada is just one economy. So it does not allow for the breakdown of results between different provinces. This could be a future project that we may potentially look at, but nothing's planned right now to look at individual provinces to model them. Any other questions here? There's another question on energy storage. How is storage taken into account? Olivia, I think the electricity module just meets demand and does not include storage seasonally. I could be wrong in that because there's been some updates to the electricity module.
Yeah, I can give a quick overview. Our electricity model is relatively crude compared to other electricity models. It's not an hourly demand forecast, it's an annual demand forecast. So what we do is we meet peak demand for the year. And so storage is accounted for in that calculation, but all of this is, an annual estimate. So it's not doing an hourly or seasonal forecast. We do account for, demand, management strategies, the grid battery storage, those are accounted for in the peak demand calculations.
There's a few more questions. We do still have time. And if people don't have many other questions, I'm sure they will have more as they go and explore the tool. There's a question here. Does the model include cost-benefit analysis for different policies? I'll take a first crack at trying to answer that question, and then I'll maybe pass to Olivia to answer that. So the model looks at both energy use, demand, as well as cash flow for the different sectors. So the costs are included. In terms of the benefits, certainly the parameters that are modeled within the tool itself, like emissions, jobs, health impacts, those could be viewed. Other benefits that are not included in the model, like indirect benefits, those are likely not included. But there's so much in the model that allows you to design any scenario and see what these look like. But from a cost and cash flow basis, that is all being modeled in the tool itself. Olivia, do you want to add to that in terms of what other benefits versus costs are there in the model itself?
Yeah, I'll just actually maybe quickly share my screen and just show that there is this net present value calculation where we take into account the relative cost or cost savings of different policies compared to their CO2 abatement potential through 2050. So this axis is the width is like equivalent to the CO2 reduction possible, and then up and down is the cost savings or additional cost per policy. So this is like a really nice visualization for seeing the contribution of different policies to the cost abatement curve. It's like very similar to the McKinsey cost curve and how we calculate it.
Yeah, thanks for that. I'm always a big fan of marginal abatement curves. There is a question here on if there's a lever for different rates of compliance. For example, if industry compliance with regulation is less than 10%. So the model itself allows the user to pick whatever trajectory that the model ramps up or ramps down to. So if you want to indirectly model the impact of a specific policy, I'm just going to pick the example of zero emissions vehicle standard and say, okay, the policy says that it's 80% by this year, but I want to model 75% in this year, or I want to model a slower trajectory. Let's say it ramps up kind of 50% 2 years before, and then it jumps to 85%. You can manually go and add those years in each policy. And on top of that, you can then manually add it to the different subcomponents. So the tool allows you to indirectly create these scenarios and run as many sensitivities as you can to model these. I don't think it would. I don't think the model allows for compliance. So because the model is just going to calculate whatever number you give it, and it's going to run through the entire economy to see what the impact of that number. But you can change the trajectory of each policy, and then you can see what the results of that look like. Other question here.
I can tackle that one.
Sure, go for it.
Yeah, so we do model to peak demand, but what we do also is kind of carefully calibrate a capacity expansion to other more accurate electricity models. And we find that our model actually does fairly well in forecasting additional capacity each year. So we do take into account inputs from other models that are, you know, likely more hourly demand specific, and we just try to calibrate our model to those results. But we do find that our annual method works pretty well at estimating, you know, additional capacity per year. Hopefully that answered it.
Yeah, got one more question. So the question is, can the efficiency of the given policy evolve over time? Is it dynamic? The answer is yes, and then the user can choose how the policy change over time. So maybe Olivia, if you can just quickly share that to reiterate how the trajectory could potentially be added. It's easier to show it again. We did demo this earlier, but it's probably worth showing it again just to show how that looks like. So if we may still have a minute to show that.
Yeah, you want me to share the screen? All right. Yeah, this actually is pretty easy to do. So for example, under the building efficiency standards, you can, you know, use this lever to increase building efficiency, and you can also customize the implementation schedule per year. So if you wanted it to increase linearly, it'll do that by default. So it'll achieve 100% of the efficiency target in 2050, and between those years increase linearly. But you can also add your own, you know, policy schedule if you wanted the entirety of the policy to be achieved by 2030, for example. You just click add here, type in the year and the implementation, click OK, and then click save, and you'll see that this will, you know, now be fully implemented by 2030 instead of linearly. Just flip to the emissions graph. And see that the building efficiency standards policy reflects, you know, that implementation schedule. There's also a few other kind of nonlinear dynamics, which is we account for changes in technology improvements. So for example, the more EVs that are deployed, the more the battery cost will come down quickly. So that kind of interaction is accounted for as well in the model. And there are ways to model technology improvements and reductions in cost in some of the policy settings.
Thank you for that, Olivia. I'm sure there's going to be some more questions as people roll up their sleeves and try this. Speaking for myself, I initially did have lots of questions after I started just playing with the model. So I encourage you all to just go to the tool, explore what it can do. Sometimes the results will make sense. Sometimes it's going to be counterintuitive. We do have some support available through the email we just showed. And if someone could just maybe include it in the chat as well, that would be great. So for the different users of the model, I think there was a question that just popped up here about training available. We don't have any official training available at this point, but if there is enough interest and demand for some hands-on work for the tool, I think we'd be happy to look into that. So the best way to follow up with that will be through this email that's dedicated to this tool, and we'll be happy to respond to any questions that people have. And with that, just doing a final check on questions. I don't think there are any, so we'll give you some of that time back. So just want to say thank you again for the time for engaging with us today. Hopefully you found this very helpful and informative, and we look forward for you to go and just try the tool and see what insights you may be able to come up with it, and potentially collaborate with others on the same thing. So with that, we'll end and say thank you to everyone.